Hi, I'm Aaron Tomlinson. Welcome back to the channel. I want to talk in this episode about one of the most controversial things that I ever talk about when I'm engaging with people in spiritual conversations or spiritual circles, particularly New Age circles or circles that depend a lot on channeled works like A Course in Miracles or the Law of One or other readings from channeled entities. And that is about the concept of the ego, the ego. The term ego is a very slippery term. It's very ambiguous. And here's what I mean. It's one of those words that we think we understand, but we may have a lot of misunderstanding about because when you use the term, it really depends on the context in which your listeners or your hearers are hearing you use the term ego. And here's what I mean. If I speak about ego to just the common culture, there is a tendency to have a negative connotation to it because the meaning of the word is someone who's very arrogant, someone who's very prideful, someone who's very egotistical, right? Maybe someone who's very self-centered or a little bit narcissistic. Generally, in our culture, if you use the word ego, that's how people hear it. Now, if I'm speaking in the context of psychology, then people are going to hear that perhaps through the lens of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud popularized the term ego in Western culture through his model of the personality, which consisted of three major parts. The id, which consists of sort of chaotic primordial energies of the human being, most importantly for Freud, would be sex. And then there was the superego, which was the internalized moral code and values of the culture in which you are raised, which includes your family, it includes extended family, your nationality, ethnicity, etc., and so on. And then the mediator between the superego and the id was what Freud called the ego, or the sense of self, or the part of ourselves that would try to find balance and harmony between the desires of the id, again, the primordial chaotic desires of the id, and the values of the culture that had been internalized in order to keep the id in check. And so psychological health from a Freudian perspective, and really from almost any psychological perspective, is that someone has a very strong, very solid, very sound, very robust ego. But then if I come over into spiritual circles and I start talking about the ego, it would seem in most of those communities that the ego is seen as the major problem. Seen as the sense of self as an other, which creates this sense of separation from oneness, this sense of separation from oneness that we have with other human beings, oneness that we have with God, oneness that we have with all of the universe. It makes a certain amount of sense that if we have a individual self, that individual self does create a sense of separation from other selves and from everything else around us. So, of course, then, if the major presupposition in those groups is everything is one thing or all is one, that we're all the same entity living out separate lives in illusion, then we would need to remove the ego. We would need to dissolve the ego. We would need to deal with the ego in order to experience this sense of oneness. Now, here's the problem that I see with that teaching. And the first problem, well, few problems that I see, but the first problem that I see with that teaching is that the reasoning itself is very circular. Here's what I mean by that. If by removing the ego, I'm removing the sense of self, but I identify that, oh, that's my ego. Let's just say I've got to get rid of my ego. Well, who is the part talking that's saying my ego? If the ego is the sense of self, which creates separation, and we say my ego, then who's the my there? Isn't the my just another formation of the ego? Or if we say I experience oneness, or I believe in oneness, or I operate in oneness, well, who's the I that's operating in oneness? Who's the I that's experiencing oneness? Isn't that a separate sense of self that's having the experience? Doesn't an experience require an experiencer? If it doesn't require an experiencer, then how can there even be an experience? Now, these ideas may seem trivial, they may seem a little bit benign, but in actuality, they can be quite disturbing and dangerous. So, for example, if we carry this teaching out and we say, there is no self in here, all the self is an illusion. So anything that you think of as yourself is an illusion. Well, who's doing the thinking about the self? So I think it clears up a lot of confusion if we just identify the ego as our sense of self at any point in time, any point in time and space. Any sense of self that you have is therefore ego. In fact, the word ego comes from a Greek and Latin term, which simply means I. So anytime we start a sentence with I, anytime we talk about my or mine or this or that relates to us, anything that relates to us, then that would include an ego. That would include a self. That would include some sense of separation. In fact, there can be no relationship if there's not at least more than one thing. For something to be in relationship, it has to be in relationship with something else. So if I try to totally dissolve my ego, if I try to totally dissolve my sense of self, if I try to get rid of that, then how on earth can I have a relationship even with a spiritual teacher? Even as a student of a spiritual teacher, if I get rid of the ego, then who's having the relationship with a spiritual teacher, or who's getting rid of the ego? You see the problem? You see the circular reasoning there? If not, maybe rewind it and play it again and then just take a few minutes to think about it. There are certain clinical diagnoses in the mental health world, specifically narcissistic personality disorder, a clinical diagnosis, or sometimes borderline personality disorder, a clinical diagnosis. Oftentimes the problem or one of the symptoms of these disorders is that the person has no real sense of self inside of them. So for example, for a narcissist, their sense of self is completely externally derived. It's derived from the attention that they're receiving from others. It's derived from the adulation that they're receiving from others. It's derived from how many likes or followers they have, or who's noticing them, who's paying attention to them. But when it comes right down to it, if you take away all the externals, if you take away all of the attention, if you take away all of the narcissistic supply, then the narcissist has no real sense of self inside of them. And the same thing can be true for people with borderline personality disorders. So if we're encouraging people to dissolve their sense of self, or if we're telling people as a truth, there is no self there, there's only ego, there's only illusion, there's only thoughts and emotions and beliefs and ideas, and all of that is ego and all of that is illusion, and that we need to divest ourselves of the ego, then aren't we pushing them into possibly, potentially, clinically diagnosable mental conditions? That people who have those conditions live very difficult, very chaotic lives? So I propose a different approach when we're talking about the ego. And of course, I'm coming from having been informed by psychology, but not just by psychology, but having spent 30 years at discussing and thinking about and philosophizing and teaching and interacting with other people on these topics and about the ego. And I think what we want is a very robust ego, a very strong and stable and self-regulated sense of self. I think it's important for us to know ourselves. If there is no self there, then how do we know where our limitations are? How do we know what our weaknesses are? How do we know what we're good at? How do we know what our gifts are? How do we know what our purpose is? How do we know what our contribution is? See, all of that, purpose, contribution, service to others. Well, if there's service to others, there has to be a self that's serving the others. And the truth is that you and I cannot make good contact with people out there, good, healthy contact, and build good and healthy relationships if we don't have good contact with the self that's inside of here. If we don't have good contact with ourself, we cannot have good relationship or make good contact with others in the world. We can't serve others without there being a self that's actually serving others. We can't love unless there is a self that is giving love, and we can't receive love unless there's a self to receive the love that's there. So this idea that there is no self is very dangerous. But here's the other thing about it. It can make people very susceptible to cult leaders. It can make people very susceptible to cultish groups. It can make people very, very susceptible to mind control and control by other people, especially if they're charismatic, especially if they're dynamic. Because one of the things that religion and cults and all of these groups have in common is that you give up your self-empowerment, that you stop listening to your body when it's trying to tell you that something's wrong. You stop listening to that gut instinct that says, oh, something's not right here. Something's not right about this situation or about this person that I'm interacting with. You're not allowed to ask questions because the questions are just coming from the ego. You're not allowed to experience, in worst case scenarios, you can be experiencing abuse in the cult system from other people. You can be experiencing mistreatment in the cult system from other people or from the cult leader. But if you voice that, that's just attachment to your ego. That's just attachment to your thoughts or your ideas or your feelings. And you need to release that and you need to dissolve that because we are all one. So while I'm not trying to argue the veracity or the validity of the teaching of oneness or of the mystical path that says we need to dissolve the ego. But I am saying there can be some dangerous repercussions to people when we teach these kinds of things. I think it's healthier if we think about the ego, our sense of self, as one giant container. And in that container, there are beliefs. In that container, there are ideas. In that container, there are opinions, intuitions, imaginations, emotions. And that's part of what makes us human. That's part of what we embraced when we said that we were going to come here so that we could operate in this world. And we want to be able to have a strong sense of self so that we're not thrown off kilter or off balance when people come at us, especially if they come at us with things that absolutely don't seem to make any sense to us at that time. Listen, if it doesn't make sense to you, even if it's true, it's not your time to hear it. And so the person saying it is out of order. The person saying it is out of line. And you're not connected to them. You're not part with them. You're not in fellowship with them necessarily, especially if they require that you acknowledge it, or they require that you deal with it, or they require that you agree with them in order for them to have relationship and fellowship with you. So I think it's dangerous for us to say we need to dissolve our ego. I think it's dangerous to say that it's bad to have opinions or ideas or intuitions or beliefs. And I think we need to work towards this container. If there's negative beliefs about the self, then let's change those. Let's transform those, or let's get rid of those. If there are beliefs about the self that aren't aligned with reality, then that is a delusion. That is a hallucination. And we need to address that. If there's trauma there, we need to heal that. If there's pain there, we need to heal that as well, or at least sit with it and be okay with it. See what I'm saying? But we don't throw out the whole container. We just recognize maybe we assimilated certain values and certain beliefs and certain morals of the culture around us that don't fit with our authentic self and our authentic soul. See, I do believe that in the human soul. I do believe in that we come here with an individuated soul, with an individuated purpose to learn things and to assimilate things from this experience that we then take with us into whatever is there for us after we leave this physical body. And so I want to encourage you, if some of that teaching didn't sit well with you, if it didn't work for you, or if you found yourself or find yourself in some kind of a cult group where they're gaslighting you and causing you to really question who you are, what you think, and what you're about, those are real red flags. And you don't have to surrender your autonomy, your self-empowerment, and your sovereignty over your own life and your own choices and your own decisions. And the moment you do that, the moment you start to look outside more than you look inside for guidance, is when you can get yourself into really painful and destructive situations. So I hope this video was helpful for you. If you liked it, please hit subscribe, please hit like. And we do have a private Facebook group called New Day Global. I'd love to have you join that. The link is in my bio, and I will be with you again in another video. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. This is Aaron Tomlinson, and whatever time it is there for you, I hope that you're well, I hope that you're safe, and I hope that you're blessed.